You're live. Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel. It says I'm live. The timer is stuck. Anyway, so this is Father David Johnson's autobiography, Led by a Thread. I did not know of his existence until he died, and his funeral was today. Unfortunately, I was unable to make it all the way to Carlisle. I partly feel bad about that. The final farewell, but I'm going for me rather than him. He wouldn't know I'm there. Though, I wish to posthumously honor him. We owe a moral duty to history to tell the truth and to exalt those people like him who really merit recognition. He deserves a statue. So he was the finest priest I ever met. And I bumped into him at Windsor Eden Riverside Station 10 years ago. I will never forgive myself for not taking his number again. So he died about 10 days ago. And I would Google searched him a few times over the years, written to the Catholic Herald, Archbishop's House, Eton. Nobody seemed to know where he was. He'd retired in the Lake District. He was in Abingdon several years ago when I was not far away. But anyway, it pains me I never got to say more recently just how ingratiated I am to him. But anyway, on with his autobiography. He dedicated to Tony Battle, a priest he got to know in the English College in Rome, who died at the relatively young age of 63. He said a priest of convinced left-wing opinions. But in the introduction, Father Forrester goes on about just how difficult it is to be a priest these days, how disrespected they are, the suspicions that people have about them, and so on. So, as he says, it's no joke, a phrase he used later on. So you can see I've read it avidly, underlined so much, saying how lucky he was to have his family. But however, his family was far from idyllic. They were actually quite well off. I always assumed he was from somewhere in southern England, because he spoke more or less RP. But actually, he's from Rushden in Northamptonshire. I'd never heard of that small town. One brother, 12 years older. I do recall him saying at Mass how his elder brother had been killed in the war in Italy, and relating that story about going to see his grave, about his good friend, an Italian doctor who later became a distinguished pediatrician. Because Father Forrester, he took over as Catholic Chaplain of Eton in 1996, and he'd been eased into the role, preaching, I think, a few times in the year running up to that, when Father Peter Knott, S.J., was still the chaplain. And Father Knott was getting on. When I first met him in 93, he was like more or less as deaf as a post. A lovely chap, but really didn't connect. And he would simply read his essay. That would be his homily. Had missed lesson one of public speaking. A decent person, but, not someone who really animated people. And Father Forrester says much for his abilities as a preacher that almost 30 years later, I can remember the particulars of some of what he said. So he said he connected to me. And he's saying here that his father was a compulsive womanizer. His mother was reduced to tears. Father Forrester's elder brother, 12 years older, was away at boarding school, scarcely knew him. Father Forrester was about 10 when his elder brother was killed, hadn't seen him for a couple of years because of the war, and so on. So his unusual family background, nominal Anglican, worshipped with the Salvation Army a lot of the time. Who would have guessed it would end up a Roman Catholic? So that's it. It goes on. I mean, his prose is lively yet somehow spare. Is it got dynamism to it? There is seldom a dull moment in the whole narrative. So he can lay bare somebody with just a few words. You very much had the measure of people, because I know some of the people whom he described, and I recognized numerous anecdotes through here. And I'm one of those people who, when I start reading a book, and I think I got this from When Harry Met Sally, can go right to the last page to find out what happened. So if I die before the end, I know what the ending is. Although actually, I fast forwarded the chapter on Eton, hoping I'd raise an honourable mention. Vain person that I am. But I suppose obliquely said he often had to go to the headmaster and plead mercy for miscreants, and his intercessory endeavours, well, certainly was crowned with success in my case, and I know numerous others. So he had a really horrific time at the Duke of York military school in Dover, where he went from the age of 9, an all-male establishment, and he said that the bullying was horrendous. Nothing was done about it. He was there during the prayers. So obviously he's actually incredibly self-effacing, doesn't go on about how bright he was, because then I do remember him telling me this in person, that only 4 of them wanted to go to university, and I recall he said one of them wanted to go to Birmingham, which seemed a peculiar choice. I hadn't remembered that one of them wanted to go to Cambridge, and there was another one going to Oxford as well. And the colonel was saying, you will receive no help whatsoever. Indeed, they didn't. And they had to pass responsions to go to Oxford in those days, an exam in Latin, ancient Greek, and maths, which he duly passed. So he was a very, very brilliant chap. He doesn't say what class of degree he got. I mean, it may well have been a first. he what a high achiever, obviously English, Latin, Greek, French, Italian, and he did a DPhil as well, a doctorate at the finest university in the world, particularly in history. So he was just incredibly modest. What a loving, Christ-like person he was. So yeah, and his parents were aghast when he said he wanted to become a priest. Another thing that was a revelation to me is when he was 17, he struck up a romantic relationship with a Jewish girl, and their parents forbade them to write to each other. It being just after the Holocaust, she really couldn't marry out. That would be a betrayal of the faith. They really needed to rebuild the Jewish population. A mixed faith marriage is quite often a no faith marriage. But when he was 18, they even got engaged to each other. But this young lady he was affianced to suddenly cut him dead. No more correspondence. She and he had to send their letters to the kindly Aunt Hilda, who exchanged them because their parents would not let them send letters to each other. And then Father Forrester, David Forrester, as the boy was then called, went to Aunt Hilda saying, "Why on earth is she not writing to me, this girl?" And then it didn't say anything, simply showed her a photo of that young lady in her wedding dress descending the steps of a synagogue, arm in arm with a young man. You can imagine Father Forrester's reaction. He wasn't handled with kid gloves. I wonder if that's broke his heart. Maybe that's why he became a celibate, because nothing could ever match her love ever again. So, I mean, it's a heart-rending tale. You'd have to be made of stone not to be moved by that one. So so far as I know, that was the only romantic, intimate relationship he ever had in his hands. I mean, there are other things he told me that I can recall all these decades later. For example, he started to smoke when he was an undergraduate because he didn't know what else to do with his hand at parties, or he was a cox because he was about 5'5", and then there was some sort of clash, and he was summoned to a meeting of all the coxes in Oxford, but he sort of got out of that one. He wasn't in big trouble because some people thought he'd done something wrong, but it was okay, and so on. And his time in national service, because I realized it was the age to do national service, but he never ever talked about that. So he was an undemonstrative sort. But I wish I could give him a hug, and I actually kissed his photo on the back. What a fatherly person, who was so good, so comforting, so non-judgmental, as he often pointed out, was so important, and actually doesn't come naturally to priests, some of whom are moralizers. And he said he was a little bit left-wing. I do remember him saying, as he mentions here, that he voted Labour under Harold Wilson because he got a grant to do his doctorate. And I was such an ignoramus at the age of 17. I said Wilson was a Conservative Prime Minister. He was a Labour Prime Minister. I didn't say something that fundamental. So I've got to remember this when I'm dealing with adolescence myself. Wilson had stepped down as Prime Minister only 20 years before I said that, and I didn't know that Wilson was Labour. So for someone who's fascinated by politics, that was just monumental ignorance on my part. Anyway, and so on. He does repeat a few pet phrases, but it's never too wordy. It's never leaden. I will be a little bit critical of. Though I loved him, that doesn't mean that his book is without its flaws. He taught at Haberdasher Asks and so on, and he almost became a civil servant at the House of Commons. He worked at Churches College and things like that. And there are a few amusing anecdotes. But what else was I going to point out? Yeah, and he did. I remember the lecture he gave in '96 about the Oxford movement, the very first I've ever heard of it. I can remember so much about it, recommending the poem Dover Beach about the Sea of Faith and Matthew Arnold, and really that was his shtick. He also told us about the French Revolution, but more about the necklace affair, Cardinal de Rohan, and the restoration of the monarchy in France. So much, and I can remember it so many years later. I remember one boy in the class said, "Do you believe Protestants will go to hell, sir?" And he said, "Certainly not." I wish he'd said, "Only you, Nicholas," to the one who said that. But anyway, so there are a few physical descriptions of people. And then his DPhil thesis topic was Edward Bouverie Pusey, who he taught us about. Of course, I'd never heard of him before. There's Pusey House, named his honor, an old Etonian, and so on. So he was an author of numerous books, 5 books actually, including this one. I hadn't known that. So I do want to read that young Dr. Pusey, Fully Alive, I Know Their Sorrows, Listening with a Heart, and so on. And he was someone who passionately believed in prayer. Not my bag, but I have to respect the man's tenacity and commitment. And so on. Yeah, so that Italian doctor who was his dear friend, Gianpaolo Donzelli, he mentions as well, and his difficult time in the English college in Rome. What he doesn't say about the Venerable English College, which he said to me, is that he was fed up and had his bags packed and almost left thrice, but was dissuaded, and so on. And there was some sort of silly aspects to it that they weren't allowed in and out. There he was, age 34, and treated like a child, and things like that. Someone had been an army officer and a teacher for so many years, and mentioned circles. We used to sit in a circle and chat. And he said that was to avoid particular friendships, as he puts it, in inverted commas, where's the particular friendships, which I presume he's alluding to homosexual liaisons, because some of these were men in their early 20s, and say you're not attracted to the opposite sex. Oh, fantastic, you can become a priest, not even acknowledging the possibility that people were homosexual, which of course some they were. And surveys have showed that 50% of Catholic priests are gay in their inclination. Not saying they're active, most of them, but perhaps a few of them would have been. So it really does seem inhuman to insist on this celibacy. But there was never a whisper that he once violated his vows of celibacy, and so it goes on. Yeah, it's very entertaining, it's edifying, and so on. Yeah, moving moments about going to his brother's grave, which he'd never ever seen before, visiting for the first time, age 35, and then his Italian doctor friend Donzelli saying, "You have no brother. I will be your brother from now on." And Father Forrester took it as just some emotional gesture that Italians are prone to. But no. He meant it in an almost literal sense, and the rest of the family too, inviting him to everything. So it's quite well traveled. He'd been to Israel. And then, so then he's ordained, then he's in Portsmouth and so on, and he's rescuing people from bullying. So he was a man of most extraordinary compassion. And I didn't know anyone who had a bad word to say about him, because I was in his first C Bollock class when he arrived. And the boys were not particularly respectful. I mean, we were well brought up. We were fairly deferential. They weren't going to be that bad. But he had some difficulties keeping order. We didn't challenge him too much, I suppose, because he was just too merciful for his own good, really. I remember him marking my trials, and one of those questions about something about English literature, in history, though. And I gave me a fairly poor mark. He said, "Well, quoting loads of lines at Shelley at me is no good," because I can remember, like this morning, that clearly the things that he said to me, his facial expressions. What a lovely person. I wish there were a film about him. So I was really privileged to know him. Probably the most adorable person I met at Eton all that time. And obviously I was in touch with him a little bit. I mean, last I was in email contact with him in 2007. So I can't claim to have known him that well, especially in his declining years, because when by serendipity I bumped into him 10 years ago, he had this flat affect. His atonal voice saying, I know you, but I can't remember your name. Wow. Anyway, I just wish I'd brought a bit more happiness to him in his last years. That there's a vignette in here about some couple wanting to get married. Does anyone have any objection? Yes. Oh my God, taking them out of the church and speaking to them in the sacristy. And she said, "Oh well, he's a cat at the boundary, broken girls' hearts. Well, this is not a legal impediment," and so on. What do you do with that one? He said, 5 years in the seminary, no one had thought to prepare him for that eventuality, which fortunately never transpired again, and so on. So he recognized the frailties of his brother priests. They were all too human. Some of them liked the sound of their own voice overmuch, a bit like myself. And they had the wrong motivations. Some of them, he wanted to be an actor, but he couldn't face the financial insecurity, and so on. There's mother's vocation and so forth. What was his? But he really believed he had this relationship with Jesus Christ. He said, at the age of 9 on a certain beach in Devon, he suddenly became intensely aware of the presence of God and so on. And he was a fervent believer in the real presence of the body of blood of Jesus Christ at the Eucharist. Astonishing for a man of such extraordinary intelligence, such an inquiring mind, so analytical, to believe that. But there we go. There's no doubt that he did. And so much so, his mother even converted at the age of 90, this woman who had been adamantine in her opposition to him crossing the Tiber. But he won her over in the end. Well, didn't even particularly try. So she seems to be a woman who was most formidable. And then one of the hilarious anecdotes is when he goes to Texas towards here. I remember he related us to this at Mass one time, that there was a ecclesiastical symposium in San Antonio, and he flew out as vice chairman of the Council of Priests of England and Wales. And there were 400 priests from all over the United States, but a considerable minority from Texas, because the Texans were hosting it, and they were full of braggadocio. They would never stop harping on about the inherent superiority of all things Texan, and of course the others found this rather trying, the Americans from all the other states. Anyway, to humor them, he went to the Alamo to pay his respects, and then he was invited to address the assembled priesthood, and he couldn't resist cracking a quip and saying that he saw the monument was to those who died for Texas and freedom. Now, of course, he would sympathize with anyone who would lay down his life for freedom. But why on earth would anybody die for Texas? And then there was the longest 3 seconds of his life, and he thought he was going to be lynched because they were just irate, the Texans. But the priests from the other 49 states erupted in raucous applause. And then they noisily applauded everything he said ever after. So, because he said for a second he thought, I committed the biggest mistake of my life. But there we are. And then another bit that I remember him telling us years ago is there was one priest from Nicaragua, a slaughterhouse state in Central America, with his particularly vicious civil war going on. Civil wars are seldom pretty, but this was just beyond the beyond for barbarity. And this bishop there said had a lot of his priests killed. Would anyone be willing to volunteer to go and take their place? 5 priests out of 400 stepped forward. Wow. And then he deals with when AIDS broke out. I remember in C Block, when a lecture on AIDS, it was Father Forrester who delivered it. A very compassionate man. Didn't matter how you caught it. You know, he didn't look down on anyone. It didn't really disapprove of anyone. It was always maybe the sin he was against, not the sinner. And his time in Oxford as chaplain, and it was a revelation to me that he was none too enamored of most of the dons there, and so on, and how he got to know Peter Mandelson, Charles Pole, who was one of Blair's sidekicks, and then on a private jet to France. And I had some role in this. So then he persuaded Lord Mandelson, as he now is, to come to Eton to address the boys. It was a term after I left, and I happened to be there to sort out my UCAS form when I went in and heard the address by Peter Mandelson. Father Forrester didn't want me there. And when Peter Mandelson was coming in his government car to Western Yard, I was just outside the arch, and he was saying, "Go away, George," pretending to kick me, Father Forrester. But perhaps I should have had the decency to take the hint and bugger off. But there we are. But then he goes on to, he spends his time at Eton, and that was it. What was I going to say? And tricks in Oxford University. The Newman Society was going, and he founded a Newman Society in Eton. And I remember when the Duke of Norfolk came and addressed us, and the Duke of Norfolk said, always argue with the bishops. He was the leading Catholic layman, and of course contraception should be allowed. And said, well, what does David think? Oh, David left the room. I remember Ewan McCowan loudly laughing at that point, as though Father Forrester was too embarrassed about that one. Goodness. So that was him. He was a very cultured person, often went to the theatre as well. He wasn't musical as far as I know. I was talking about that relationship we had with that young woman when he was his adolescence. But, you know, his timbre made me think he was gay. He was faintly camp. I had no suspicion that he was actively gay. I could be wrong. The only evidence we have about his sexual orientation is that he was hetero, but that was it. And said that celibacy was hard. He wasn't talking about the physical side so much as the lack of intimacy and emotional support, and therefore was absolutely right to seek it from friends. So he really lived the gospel, and he tried to bring the good news to people, to help people in their darkest hour. And he was an astute judge of character. He really got the measure of Mr. Lewis, who was the headmaster of Eton when I was there, J.E. Lewis, and saying he was deceptively shy, private, and sometimes awkward man. He was also a gentleman, except when roused. Socializing did not come easy to him, and it goes on. But that's quite true. Lewis' shyness is meaning he did not have strong and definite views. Sorry. It would have been a mistake to interpret Lewis's shyness as meaning he did not have strong and definite views, but he was also a highly analytical thinker. As so often, this combination of qualities meant that he saw too many sides to any question and was notoriously slow in coming to his decisions. And it's that sort of a clarity of prose which makes it a magnificent book. And I remember this slowness in arriving at a decision actually was to save me when I was in a spot of bother. And of course, it was Father Forrester who did more than anyone to save my neck. So, and I just didn't repay him enough. I used to write to him every year for several years afterwards, expressing my eternal gratitude to him. What a lovely chap. I hope I brought a little bit of happiness to me. He brought a lot of joy to me. I just wish I'd spent more time with him. And where that is the lesson, is tarry not. If there's someone you love out there in any sense, never waste a moment. Contact them today. You will not regret it. You might get rebuffed, fine, but you tried. If you didn't try and then you lost them, you never forgive yourself. And I'm in that situation, and so on. So he was perhaps too tolerant of insolence from boys, but then he liked to exact vengeance by publicly humiliating them when they were leaving in talks 5 years later. Some F-blockers who'd had the conceit and the nerve to mock him to his face in the very first week. But he liked to puncture pomposity, talking about their swagger and so on. So he said that Eton would let everybody plough their own furrow. what was I going to say? So after 8 years at Eton, he stood down, and he was adored by boys, beaks, and parents alike. So and then it goes on about the funerals he had to conduct and things like that. He mentions Ronald Knox, an old Etonian who was a convert to Catholicism, later chaplain at Oxford, and his book, A Spiritual Aeneid, about his time at Eton, which I hadn't even known existed until I dipped into this book. And he was at Waldingham, this girls' school, for about 4 years, but he was a chaplain, and there were no teaching duties. But so he was held in very high regard there. But I remember one of perhaps the very first sermon I saw him preach, homily rather, saying, well, I was involved in a girls' school, and I used to say, is anybody going to Italy this summer? Yes, we are, a few of them. Yes. Well, if you meet a boy there says, te amo, I love you, it's like this, and talking about the various types of love and God's love for us and things like that. So that is how marvelous he was, that I can remember this. And that's like 27 years later. Is it more? So there he is. He had no regrets. I'm very glad that he found his life entirely rewarding. They're very, very trying at times. What a good person. That is Father David Forrester. I really hope there is somewhere for him and that he is in a better place. I really wish I could meet him again. Thank you so much for watching my video. Goodbye.